Hello and welcome once again to Kitaabi Baatein. I'm Abhishek, also known as Books Wale Bhaiya. My guest today is Ambassador Rajiv Dogra, a person whose books I have read all of his books and I truly loved reading his books and the insights which it carries. Ambassador Dogra, it's most certainly an honor to have you on my podcast.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to be with you, and always astonishing that despite all your work schedule, you're, you're able to find time to read so many books and to read them thoroughly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I would like to give a brief introduction of Ambassador Dogra. Ambassador Dogra is a writer, television commentator, and artist. A career foreign services officer, he was India's ambassador to Italy and Romania, the permanent representative to the United Nations agencies in Rome, and the last consul general in Karachi. Ambassador Dogra is one of India's foremost commentators in foreign policy and strategic affairs. He is a best selling author of several books, including Where Borders Bleed and Durand's Curse. Uh, so let's start with your latest book, Autocrats, Charisma, Power, and Their Lives. I noticed that the last book which you wrote was Wartime, wherein you talked about the world moving into a conflict era kind of thing, wherein we are likely to see more wars. And in this book, you talked about autocrats and the fact which you mentioned that the world is likely to see more autocrats in the future. Are you sensing something dangerous on the geopolitical front?
So, the progression from wartime to autocrats was natural because wartime I envisaged that the world is sliding towards difficult times. That if it does not think back, takes a pause, and decides to give peace a chance, then the possibility is that we may be in a situation where we may nearly have the entire world in some kind of a conflict. As it is, parts of Europe, or I would say entire Europe, because NATO is quite clearly involved, at least indirectly, if not directly, in the Russia Ukraine war.
Yes.
Similarly, Israel versus Hamas has become much more than Hamas, with the Houthis, Iran, Lebanon also involved. So things are not quite comfortable, I would say. So that is why these two are interconnected. Uh,
Right.
the wartime followed by autocrats.
Right. So, as you mentioned in your book, that if we look at history, it's monarchy and autocracy which have been kind of default setting for many countries, and democracy had relatively is a relatively newer phenomena or a phenomena which occurred in lesser countries for a lesser period of time. Given the fact that autocracy has always been there, how do you see this phase and the future different from what we saw in the history?
Well, there are differences which are subtle. Otherwise, in form and substance, the control is the same.
Yes.
Uh, in previous generations, dictators or tyrants used to kill people by hundreds, thousands, and sometimes even millions. Whether it was Changiz Khan or Mao, not directly, but because of its actions in the Great Leap Forward, nearly 45 million people died. Today, it is not the slaughtering of people that takes place. People do not get killed or die in hundreds of thousands or millions because of the actions of the top man, the autocrat. Well, control is nearly the same. Control through
Right.
media, control through institutions, control through army and policing establishment. That is just about the same.
Right.
So the difference is in the message.
Right. So with the new age autocrats or dictators give using maybe more sophisticated ways to justify their rule, would that's how you like to put it? Instead, as you mentioned,
Well,
instead of
exactly,
slaughtering.
because today, the world is more interconnected. Earlier, you could do whatever in your country, and the message would spread only gradually. That means there was no internet, there was no press agencies which could carry news from one end of the world to the other in an instant. There were no international television channels, and there was no social media which could spread the message. So they could do whatever they wanted in the confines of the country because they controlled everything within that country. Today, the
Right.
situation is different. Even if human rights organizations are not affected in the world, uh, I mean, the United Nations, Amnesty International has been under a cloud for its objectivity. But even if leave aside those, the fact is today the social media is a big influencer, it's a big monitor, and so is the spread of the television. Uh, so when you carry news to other countries, for example, what is happening in Bangladesh against Hindus, we get to know the next day and we react, whether as a government or as a people, do react. And we, as people, we react on the social media. And it has
Right.
its effect that, you cannot be, have one set of rules for, let's say, the one kind of people and another set of rules for the minority. So
Right.
whether it has an immediate effect or not is a different thing, and how much of an effect it has, that's also a different thing. But it does have some kind of an effect, and that is important.
Right. So you brought forward a very important aspect of, the Hindus, they are being butchered in Bangladesh. When we talk of so much of, rights of minorities and all, it is said that, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Does this apply to dictators as well? One man's dictator is another man's freedom fighter, because what we are seeing, there are lot many people even in India who are justifying what has happened in Bangladesh. And when you talk about, the Hindus being butchered, they turn a blind eye to that. They talk in terms of the revolution that is happening, and they turn a blind eye to the fact that Hindus are being massacred, who are minority in Bangladesh. So, does the idea of one man's terrorist being another's freedom fighter is similar to autocrats as well? That one's autocrat is a freedom fighter for someone else?
Well, to some extent, that you know, uh, since my ideology or my belief teaches me that there can only be one uniformity, and that uniformity is my religion, then naturally it's an autocratic way of looking at things, or I would say even dictatorial way of looking at things, because then you're killing people and then you're converting them against their will. So that's more than autocratic.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it has happened in Pakistan where minorities have been virtually wiped out.
Yes.
There are just about 2% left of Hindus, Christians, and Sikhs. In Bangladesh, they have not been entirely wiped out, but the fact is that in 1971, 30% were minorities in Bangladesh. Today, they are just about 8%. So that means that there is something really wrong in that society where
Yes.
they either convert people or drive them out of the country or they are decimated one way or the other.
Yes. That's true. So you, in your book, there was one chapter on British imperialism, and you raised a very important point that autocracy, while it is usually viewed from the point of view of one person who is the dictator autocrat, but if you look at the British Empire as a whole, that was also an example of a dictatorship, because they ruled many countries, like many countries of the world, one at one point of time, and they let their institutions and everything, enter that country. No wonder we are still seeing a lot of imprint of the British Empire. Would you say that there are many examples in the history? For example, US has been known to, exercise their power on the world. Afghanistan, on which you wrote in your book Durand's Curse, Afghanistan is again one example of, being a nation subjugated by the Western world. Isn't a lot of countries in the Western world, their policies are also an example of dictatorship?
Well, whenever you have some kind of a control outside your borders, then you do not, by nature, treat those other people in the same manner as you treat your own citizens.
Yes.
The same rules do not apply. Let me go back in history to the age of colonialism. Now, people hero worship Napoleon. They also admire Christopher Columbus. But the fact is, both these people, they, when they ruled over a colony or their agents ruled over the colony, people in those colonies were treated as commodities to be sold as slaves. Their women were paraded naked on the street, again to be sold as slaves for some other kind. Then, if someone was caught not obeying the law according to their desires, then their ears were chopped off or hands were chopped off. That was the kind of brutality which existed on those in those times. I'll give you another example. In 1857, in the rebellion, one British officer sends back a letter to his mother in England and says that, look, you know, to discipline them, the kind of things we did was that we tied people, that means Indians, with the front end of the barrel of an artillery gun, and then we blew off the charge. And a few meters away, we found head in one direction, arms in the other direction, all blooded, and it had such an effect on other Indians. So what else is this except tyranny, except the act of a tyrant? Uh, would such a thing happen in their own England in those times? No. So
No.
similarly, in the present age, it is said that American interventions in the world over the years have resulted in millions of deaths.
Yes.
So that cannot be excused by any standard. Uh, there are other examples where one country has dominated the other and then applied force to ensure that its desire or its will is adhered to. That's not normal. That's
Right.
autocrats.
Very true. So again, coming to India, I remember I read in the book that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was of the view that India should be ruled by a dictator for first 20 years post-independence. Interestingly, this is a view which is still subscribed by many people, that Indians as such, we don't believe in the rule of law. There is a lot of, law and order machinery is in dire straits. There should ideally be dictatorship. You will hear any common man saying this. So how do you see dictatorship in the context of India? For example, we have one example of the emergency, which was again like a dictatorship, you can say. How do you see that? And do you really think that a country like India, we need a dictatorial style of leadership for some 10, 20 years?
Well, these things are said loosely by people that, we wish trains ran on time, we wish the roads were free of potholes, we wish we got 24-hour electricity and water. But that's not the purpose of life or the end of life. Life is much more than that. Life is being able to breathe freely and live freely and speak freely. Now, that is not possible under a controlled regime. You mentioned emergency. Yes, those days were difficult. So, when emergency was lifted, people felt happy, people felt free, to put it mildly. Now, the problem with us as people, not just in India but all over the world, is that once that chapter has closed, then down the years, if some civic amenities deteriorate or not up to their liking, then they say, oh, I wish there was a strong man. But the
Yes.
moment a strong man takes over, they realize that instead of improving, things have deteriorated. So by then it is too late, because once a strong man takes over, then people don't have a choice. Take the example of Pakistan. It has been under dictatorship or some kind of dictatorship for more than 100 years. What has been the result? That from a very prosperous country in 1950s, it is now a
Yes.
basket case. Take the
Yes.
example of Bangladesh. There are all signs that army is virtually ruling that country, and there are
Yes.
all indications that it is not going to go up the hill, but down the hill.
That's very true. As you talked about in the rise of autocracies, and while there are a lot of countries I noticed which were democracies and they descended into dictatorship. Pakistan is one good example. It was military dictatorship. And you talked about the reasons behind dictatorship at the very beginning, that sometimes it's the people who are unhappy. People are facing challenges, maybe inflation, joblessness, and many other issues. What you think drives a democracy's descent into dictatorship? Is it the people's problems, or is it Western intervention, or is it a mix of both?
Well, you're right. I mean, one of the major faults is with the people themselves, and that goes into the fundamental nature of human society. From the time societies were formed, from the time men and women came into being, there was always, whenever there was a group, there was always someone or the other who was a leader, either because of his actions or his abilities, or because of the desire of the people. Slowly, as societies formed into villages, small towns, bigger towns, again you had, for example, in India, we had a sarpanch, and then at the larger level of a town, you elected a mayor. So even in a school, you see, every class has a monitor or a school has
Yes.
a captain. So the desire is to designate someone or the other as a person who can lead the rest of the society or rest of the class, whatever you call it. Outside the school, there's invariably a bully, a student who dominates all the others by his physical superiority.
Yes.
It is in the human nature either to be led or to allow someone to lead them. This also applies at the largest level to the country itself or
Yes.
at the global level. That is why you have Security Council. Otherwise, what is the need? Why should you have a
Yes.
Security Council when all countries are equal in the world? So, Security Council, in a way, leads rest of the world in a slightly autocratic fashion. If you take a cynical view of it, functioning. Uh, to have some kind of an authoritarian rule is also the fault of the people themselves, that they want someone someone strong to lead them, whether it is for their ultimate good or not, as I've said, is debatable, and in most of the cases the result is negative.
That's very true. Coming to your book on Afghanistan Durand's curse, and I'm talking about that as Afghanistan is an perfect example of what Western intervention can do to a country. So ever since the Durand's line was drawn, we have seen the people of Afghanistan in one way or the other suffering. And the situation is such that today Afghanistan is probably known either for its dry fruits or for the Taliban rule. So with a regime like Taliban, ruling that, and we saw America's much touted war on terror and everything, Afghanistan is back to square one. How do you see this in the context of wars and dictatorship? And do you see any hope for a country like Afghanistan in the future?
Unfortunately, no. There's just no hope for those sad, star-crossed people of Afghanistan, not just in the present context, but right from the beginning of the history. For example, the very fact that the British young officers decided to call their first war, first Anglo-Afghan war,
Yes.
1839 to 1842, before it started, this someone asked one captain, I think, as to where he is going. So he said, I am going for a great game. Now, this 25, 26-year-old coined this term great game, and it got stuck with everyone thinking that, it's such a great thing. It might be a great thing for those people, those uh, young, uh, impetuous uh, Britishers, but it was an unfortunate reality of hardship and killing and brutality for Afghans. No game for them, and it was no gain for them. Uh, Now, what was the great game about? The British thought Russians were advancing on to Afghanistan and then on to India. So their fear was India would be captured by Russians. Whereas, as history showed, it was the British which advanced into Afghanistan and eventually grabbed 40,000 square miles in an illegal treaty. Russians were
Yes.
nowhere near Afghanistan. In fact, Abu Darya in the northern side was the limit, and they had said so repeatedly, publicly, and in recorded documents that we have no intention of entering Afghanistan. But these become convenient handles to exercise of power. But history is a cruel master. They may have decided on a great game, but the fact is that the, those three Anglo-Afghan wars felt the doom of British Empire. They led directly to the first War of Independence in 1857, and then also an idea that yes, we can take on the British and eventually gain our freedom, drive them out, and which happened over a course of time, but it did happen.
True. So, as we talked of imperialism, and it is said by many experts that imperialism, in some form or the other, still exists today. It's just that it has taken a more sophisticated shape. We have institutions who are producing, you can say, academically biased narratives. We have a lot of information technology, AI, and all, which also is leading to some form of biased views, and it is helping the superpowers to impose their views. So AI is one example, and as you talked about AI in both your books, so do you think in an era of artificial intelligence wherein the news can be, tailored as per the requirements of an organization or even a country, how do you see the future of dictatorship and wars in the era of artificial intelligence?
Well, you raised an important point. Uh, I would say that imperialism of ideas has always been very insidious. It's been very poisonous. For example, when I started writing Where Borders Bleed, which traces the history of how uh, the partition took place and how our freedom struggle was, and eventually after the partition also, what I discovered was that we were prisoners of the British historians. Our books, before I wrote Where Borders Bleed, were mostly a copy of what British historians had suggested and written in their book. I'll give you a small example. Even people like Larry Collins and Dominic Lapierre, who wrote Freedom at Midnight,
Even-
they, during their research, they went to London to meet Mountbatten. And they asked him, don't you know Jinnah was dying? He said, oh no, had I known, I would have delayed the announcement and there would have been no partition. Now, when I was researching for Where Borders Bleed, I read this interview
Yes.
and then I looked at Jinnah's pictures in 1920. He was a very healthy looking man. Then I started looking at pictures of 1930s and 1940s, and his health was visibly, it become a skeleton-like thing. So I said, how could Mountbatten lie like British had the best secret service in the world at that time. And Jinnah was consulting a party doctor in Bombay for years together for his tuberculosis. So
Yes.
didn't that doctor pass on that information to MI5 or MI6? Or if he himself would not, they would have got hold of it somehow or the other. Then he lived in London for 7 years from 1930 onwards. and
Yes.
consulted a doctor regularly because of his illness. Didn't they know at that time? So Mountbatten was bluffing, and that is why I say I'm very sorry that British historians' verdict or writing was taken as gospel truth. So I started questioning this, and that is why both in Your Bodies Bleed and Durance Curse, I have revealed for first time many of the duplicities of the British. In fact, Durance Curse still is the only book of its kind in the world. Now, coming to your question about artificial intelligence, I've written about it in Autocrats. You see, human mind works as long as the human life is there. An autocrat exists only so long as he is living in flesh and blood. Once he dies, then someone else takes over. Whether it's a democrat, dictator, autocrat, that's a different thing. But artificial intelligence, once that takes over, and I've explained how that will take over
Yes.
over a course of time in my book, once that takes over, then that is the end of all hope because that will determine how we will behave, how we will live, how we will have interstate relations, how our economy will run. And if artificial intelligence of a particular country or a society goes haywire and becomes rogue, then God help that country or society.
That's that's very true. And there's lot many, articles being published. Some go gaga over artificial intelligence, and some who are actually warning the negative, warning about the negative impacts. But only the future will tell us what exactly happens. So, sir, as you served as a last consul general to Pakistan, and you have written a very well detailed book on Pakistan, and as an observer of geopolitical trends, do you think India and Pakistan will ever be friends, at least in the near future, let's say next 1 2 decades?
Well, I don't think one should use ever because even human life is finite. It does not go on forever. And human mind can also change. After all, who would have thought that there would be two or three countries in the subcontinent? Uh, but it happened. There is India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. Uh, who would have thought China and Russia would become friends? Because once they were sworn enemies, uh, but today they are the thickest of friends. Who would have thought that Germany would decide to end the Schengen visa? That these changes happen. Changes happen in international affairs all the time, but certain mental blocks remain for a very, very long time unless there's a conscious push to remove those mental blocks. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, there is an ingrained feeling starting from the childhood level on to college and so on that India is an enemy country. Now, unless they change that mindset, unless they change that perception, the question of friendship becomes a very far-fetched one. Unless they convince themselves, for example, that trade with India is to their own benefit, you cannot have a move on to larger things of really shaking hands. So the fault lies in their self-deception that India must not be treated as a friend. That's why when we gave them MFN, most favored nation treatment, they said that sorry, we can't do that because you're not our favored nation. So these are simple things, simple examples. These are very telling in their effect. So once they have cleansed their minds of hatred of India, then the next step can follow.
That's very true. So, one last question, as a foreign policy expert, as a career diplomat, there are a lot of talks of India's foreign policy diplomacy taking a new turn since 2014 with the appointment of Mr. Modi as Prime Minister. Do you think India is rightfully asserting itself on the global stage, or do you think it's just an eyewash?
Look, that is a very difficult question to answer because I have always taken the view that as a member of a very fine elite foreign service, I should not criticize my colleagues who are currently serving in the government, nor should I criticize my government's policies. But I would only say one thing, that India from ancient times had a position in the world, whether it was 5,000 years back or 3,000 years back. India was not a country that could be ignored. And India's idea, for example, wasn't Buddhism Indian, and Buddhism became an accepted norm in large parts of the world, especially Asian world. So there was something in Indian message that people accepted. Angkor Wat in Cambodia happened because India was accepted, and India's idea of the temple or the way of living accepted. That is why you had those magnificent temples constructed there. One of the, I would say, wonders of the world. Uh, then the way we fought for our freedom, for our independence, that was also unique, and that resonated across the world. Then Mahatma Gandhi's message resonate across the world. That is also a kind of a foreign policy. And then the concept of India championing post-independence, the cause of other countries which are still under colonial rule. So India's anti-colonialism, anti-racism again found an echo everywhere in the world, everywhere in the deprived world, at least. Non-aligned was another stellar thing, which was necessary in tune with those times. So with every step, India has been active, has been involved in the world, and it is good that we continue to be involved.
So that's a good way to, I think, good food for thought to end the conversation. And yes, I remember the message in your books of both your the latest book as well as last book. Yes, we are definitely likely to see more tensions across the world, but let's hope that they do not get blown out of proportion, and we do see a more peaceful situation in the world globally, and these conflicts may come to end. All those who are watching this, well, as you already know, I'm a big fan of what Ambassador Dogra writes. I have read all of his books. And if you have not read his books, trust me, you're missing on some very critical insights. So, all of his books are something I would definitely recommend to everyone, whether you're looking for something relevant and interesting in history or whether geopolitics. Ambassador Dogra, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you once again for accepting my request. And I wish you a long and healthy life.
Thank you so much, Abhishek. It's always a pleasure interacting with you. And as I said already, admiration for your knowledge and your interest in reading, because today people are not really great uh, readers of books, which is a pity because books are ultimately what make men and women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.